The moonlight found him with a hand pressed to the scorch in his chest, as if the ache there could be stitched closed with a palm. He had not learned gentleness in the years when teeth and law answered wrongs. Cale's breath came ragged and small, a thing for a man who had once made the whole forest bow to his howl. And then, after the last terrible order, after the burning of the border village, had walked out beneath that same sky as if someone else's verdict had been nailed into his ribs. He had expected the world to spit him raw, to tear him from bone to shame, and it had. He had not expected a voice to thread through the scrub, thin and vulnerable as a moonbeam, and say two words that cut cleaner than any blade. Help me. Wait. Before the next revelation unfolds, if this story has already captured your heart, let us know where you're following from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected twists, emotional reconciliations, or new beginnings, subscribe and stay connected. Now, back to the story. The whisper came from a woman who should have no power over him. Cale had been a king, Alpha King, the beasts still call him in old tongues, ruling with an ironed copper fist, the kind of sovereign who traded mercy for order and love for law. He had worn fear like armor and tenderness like a handful of contraband fruit. Exile had stripped him of every title. Even his teeth, the rightful marks of his strength, had been picked from his name like weeds. What remained was a man who moved through ruined roads and half-ruined conscience, who slept curled against cold stone and woke with the taste of ash pressed between his teeth. When the voice came again, this time closer, urgent, threaded with a sincerity that set his old instincts to a taut wire, Cale lifted his head and saw the figure at the ridge where the scrub thinned into a patch of moonlit meadow. She stood like a spear of pale fire, young, lithe, eyes the color of distant storm, hair braided back with wolf-bone charms and simple leather. Her posture was a claim. That the word Luna hung over her like a crown was not in question. She had the ache of someone who had kept vigil beneath cold stars for too long. She had power he did not own anymore, and power he, in some small, dishonest corner of himself, still recognized as rightful. Marisol. Every syllable of her name carried the rhythm of a pack beating its chest, call and answer, hunt and hearth. She had authority in the softness of her voice, and authority wielded like a blade when she needed it. She was the Luna of a small pack at the edge of the lands he'd once called his own, a place of salt-scented pines and miles of border that had become a seam in the world where gods and men and wolves slipped through. Small packs were easy to overlook, and that oversight had become a weapon for wolves who desired control. Cale, she said, too low for any stray ear. Her eyes were fixed on the scar along his jaw, an imprint of exile, and on the hollowed hollows beneath them. You don't have to hide. Not from me. He wanted to tell her to go. He had learned the hard way that his presence meant complication, that past protections turned into future vendettas, like tinder catching flame. When he had been king, his commands had been blunt instruments of survival, sometimes necessary, sometimes monstrous. The village he had ordered burned had been a calculus he could still taste. He'd lied to save a human who'd loved him without the mask wolfkind demanded, and that lie had toppled everything. The gulls of memory still wheeled and cried over what he'd done, and he had fled because fleeing was the only honest thing left when a man cannot bind himself to the laws he once imposed. Marisol's jaw tightened, and under the moon he looked for the tremor that would speak of fear. Instead, he saw a Luna who had learned the geometry of danger and the lines where kindness might be smuggled in. Her pack's encampment lay nearer than rumors had suggested, only a night walk across ruined highway and scrub, lanterns thrown like small moons on the far horizon. Cale could smell them before he could see them, the metallic tang of wolf-forced adrenaline, human smoke, the quiet of children who thought safety was a rhythm you could fall asleep to. They say he's coming, Marisol said without preamble, and not the sort who takes with treaties. Titus Var is consolidating. He wants this line cleared. No small packs, no shelter for the human warmed. He believes only great predators should rule, and he believes in rulership that leaves no crumbs. Cale's laugh was a cracked thing. Titus Var had been an upstart when Cale still wore the crown, the kind of man who polished cruelty like a medallion. He had been the blade that cut Kale down, politics couched as justice, a trial that turned into exile because Kale had chosen love, because he had tried to bend law to preserve a human life. To Titus, the preservation of order without softness equaled strength. To Kale, the world had once been more than a ledger of dominion and loss. "You called me by name," Kale said, the admission a rusted hinge. He had expected barbs or a spear of spurned righteous fury, or the cold that pack leadership sometimes reserved for remnants of the older regime. Instead, there was pleading, and something else, an unadorned recognition, the kind that sits between strangers who are not strangers. Marisol's hands flexed at her sides. "We need someone who remembers court," she said, "someone who knows the roots, the old liaisons between packs and the human settlements, someone who knows how—" She swallowed. The word fight would have been true, but there was a gentler geometry to her need, someone who knows what to avoid. The power imbalance between them was a live thing in the breath between words. She had moral authority, Luna by birth and by the slow proving of her bones. Kale had knowledge that could tip a siege or dismantle one.
He had been a king. She had been the guardian of rights and hearths. She could refuse him for reasons that would have been just and wise. He could refuse her because his presence might invite Titus' vengeance upon those he sought to protect. Each refusal would be an act of cruelty wrought in the name of self-preservation. "Why come to me?" Kale asked finally, lowering himself onto the broken slab of highway. He kept his hands spread in a gesture learned from those who had once commanded, though now the gesture was small and without entitlement. "There are other warriors. There are betas and former allies." Marisol's laugh was short, a shiver sniped by moonlight. "You think Titus hasn't hunted them? He has a list and he crosses it off. The betas went to save their own. The allies bowed and took his favors. We are the ones who make a poor map on his table. The humans hide. The other packs say it's not their fight because we won't add to their strength. But you—" Her eyes narrowed, and Kale felt remembered and foundering at once. "You know how to undo a siege without becoming the siege yourself. You know the old secret ways in the hollow ash yards. You know the politics beneath the skin." The admission was a blade. He had not wanted to be useful. Usefulness demanded a price. Useful men were the oldest currency of the world, spent, coveted, traded. Kale's exile had taught him that the world had little use for those who could not give back what they'd taken or beg forgiveness as a coin. Yet the thought of turning away, of letting Marisol's small pack be swept like lint from a shelf, hollowed him in a way that made the old animal stir. "I lied once to save a human," he said, the confession leaving him like a small animal. "It cost me everything. I will not be the instrument that draws your blood." Her hand came up, a soft counter to his words. "I know what you did," she said simply. "They told us certain truths at the Citadel, that you burned borders, that you sacrificed smaller packs for strategy. But stories simplify men when it suits them. If you lied, it could have been to save, not to punish. I'm not naive, Alpha. I am just tired of watching people hide in basements while the world decides their worth." Kale wanted to tell her, of the human with ink-stained fingers who had once taught him how to bake with flour on his knuckles, of a laugh that had changed tides in him, of the lie he had told the court that had been construed as treason. He wanted to let her see the tenderness that had once been private as rain. But he kept his head bowed. Confessors had no crowns and no sanctity in his world. Marisol watched him with the steady hunger of someone who need not be satisfied by grand gestures alone. She needed strategy, and she needed redemption if she was to ask a man like Kale to risk his shadow on her people. "I don't ask because I'm sentimental," she said.
"I ask because you are the only one who knows the labyrinth beneath the old cotton mill where men smuggled food and secrets during the drought. The old council roads, only you could lead a ghost through them." He thought of the cotton mill and the ghosts that still lingered there, places where deals had been cut with blood and bread. He thought of how his voice had once rallied fields of wolves like a storm. He thought also of the children in Marisol's camp, of small faces peeking from behind canvas, eyes like cupped moons. Would he be the thing that brought them safe? Or would he, by his mere presence, draw down a wrath that ate them whole? "I will come," he said at last, and the word left him like an offering and an indictment both. It was not a hero's vow. It was a man betting his nothing on the slender chance that he could still do better than he had done before. Marisol's mouth softened for a heartbeat, and when she stepped closer, the wind braided their shadows together. "We won't ask you to wear a crown," she said. "We will ask you to teach, to guide, to be careful." "We" was an inclusion that stabbed with warmth. He had not been "we" in years. The pronoun had been reserved for those who walked beside and not beneath. Her hand found the place on his chest where memory still smoldered and tapped, light, not accusatory. "And you'll tell me everything," she added, "who you were keeping safe and why you walked away." The demand was equal parts tether and salve. It offered Cale a chance of confession and a chance of restraint, two things he had been bone sore for. He could choose to be dissected by 1,000 tongues, or he could be taught mercy by someone who had survived without the safety of a king. Either way, the dilemma, protect the pack from a man who would raise them, or step closer and risk inviting that man's ire, bristled into life like a live coal. They set out toward the camp under a sky that remembered his old hunting songs, Marisol leading with a lantern, and Cale trailing like a shadow that still remembered its howl. The road was littered with relics of the old rain, shards of enamel bowls he had given to children, a child's doll with a missing eye he couldn't place. Each piece was an accusation and a benediction. As they walked, Marisol told small things about her people, a healer with a limp, a boy named Tomas who mimicked wolf calls to make the dogs laugh, the fragile human who cooked porridge like holy scripture. Each name was a candle lit against the darkness, fragile and defiantly present. By the time they crested the last rise and saw the encampment, a battered ring of canvas and weathered faces, Cale felt the heavy, dull thing of decision settle into his bones. He had stepped into Marisol's life, yes, but the choice he'd made was one that could either redeem him or complete the doom he had always expected. The dilemma bent toward ruin, no matter which way he leaned. He had to teach them to be invisible without becoming invisible himself.
He had to be both shelter and mirror, to show them the old ways of stealth and the new ways of mercy. And he had to tell Marisol the truth about the human he had loved, or else the lie would become a mirror that shattered their fragile trust at the very moment they needed each other most. The moon watched them, indifferent and white, as if time itself was holding its breath. They entered the camp like two ghosts who did not belong, one because he had been exiled from memory and law, the other because she carried the weight of expectation and a lantern that made even the shadows look accountable. Faces turned, as they always did for estranged royalty, instruments tuning, hearts measuring the distance between what had been feared and what might save them now. Children pressed against hems. A woman with a crooked spine held a bowl of stew like a talisman. Marisol moved through them with an economy of affection that said, "I hold this, and you are safe enough because I say so." Cale felt that safety like a fragile thing, a bird on a wire. They set up in the council ring of the camp, an arrangement of driftwood and old crates that had been coaxed into authority. The Betas, Kadrin, and Lysa were there, the two halves of a partnership that had once been lovers and now lived perpetually in the simmer of trying to be pragmatic. Their eyes were quick with suspicion. Other faces were arrays of skepticism and hunger, young males with hands always near blades, old women whose memories were maps of every siege they'd been through. Cale saw them catalog him the way a trapper catalogs tracks, size, depth, direction. "We have to talk in the open," Marisol said, voice clipped more for show than need. "If Titus is making lists, he listens to gossip. We cannot afford the rumor mills to think we welcome a fallen king." "Aye," Kadrin said, but his mouth had an edge. "We don't need kings here, we need survival. Your call brought someone who once ordered villages burnt. Why would we trust him?" Lysa's eyes, slate and quick, flicked to Cale and then away. "Or maybe he burned to keep something," she said. "Maybe this is a trick." Cale met each glance like a man counted for sins he had not yet confessed. "I was not acting as your enemy then," he said. "I made a choice to save a life. It cost me my throne. I don't ask for trust because you owe me. I ask because I am the only one who knows the ways Titus moves and the old paths beneath the mill. I can teach you to be unseen." The murmurs coiled like smoke. Marisol did not smooth them with words. Instead, she let the silence do the work she could not. It made space for him to be judged on action and not on legend. She had refused to offer him deference, and that refusal felt like armor to Cale. He could not bribe her with contrition. He had to earn even the smallest nod by sweat and the ache of shown risk. The first lesson began at dusk. They walked along the underside of the cotton mill, beneath the river of its shadow, where scaffolding and rusted gears made a landscape of hiding places. Kale taught them how to move like the soil, softly, without announcing themselves, how to place footsteps on bone-quiet routes, how to use breath as a metronome for nerves. He taught them to read the wind as if it were language, which way it carried sound, how a footfall might announce itself through a patch of dry gravel. He taught them to be absent until they chose to be present. Marisol watched more than she practiced. She molded her learning into tactics for a smaller pack: who to send as bait, who to hide with children, who to lose in 100 harmless directions. She listened to Cadron's worries and calmed him with a hand at his wrist, small reconciliations that showed the soft architecture of leadership. Kale found himself watching her the way a desperate man watches a harbor light. She was not alert to his gaze. She taught without pretense, she did not beg for miracles, and she did not let his presence settle him into heroism. Each of these things was a revision of the man he had been, and each revision a needling pleasure that surprised him. They practiced at night, then at dawn, and their bodies remembered the old rhythms of hunt and stealth in ways that felt like both penance and release. When Marisol moved, he could see the young Luna inside the grown leader, slight impatience, a quick wit like a blade that could be used or folded away. Once, while they crouched beneath a tumbled billboard and planned routes with charcoal on scraps, her hand brushed his. It was meant to be incidental. Instead, the touch cataloged them both. Kale felt the old animal stir, memories of a different intimacy, softer and terrible. He reminded himself of his vow to keep distance. The work was what mattered. Desire, he told himself, was another danger. And yet desire was not a thing to be denied with the hard pragmatism that had gotten him banished. It was a daily small violation when their hands met upon a map, when she leaned back to laugh at a joke, a sound like clean water. It was an undercurrent in the night watches when they sat in silence, and the world was so large and terrible it needed bodies aligned at its edges. He found himself holding stories back, tales of the human with flour on his fingers, the small warmth that had been illegal and holy. Marisol asked questions that grazed the edges of that life, and each time he evaded with something clinical: tactics, terrain, ruses. She accepted his reticence like one accepts a wound you should not pick. It was kindness, and it tormented him. Rumor moved like frost. In the third week, a scout came running on bare feet, a smear of sweat and a voice like a struck bell. Titus had made a movement. He had sent a runner to quantify the border packs, to intimidate and to test.
The demonstration was designed to be small enough to frighten, but measured so it wouldn't call the elders to war. A boy's throat was slit in the fields 3 miles away. A wolfhound let loose by night mauled a woman's goat. It was meant to message, we can take what we want. Marisol responded with a steadiness that almost broke Kale. She did not call for war. Instead, she ordered the children to the cellar, the humans to the inner tents, and she sent out a party of their best to make a scene in the clearing. No blood, no danger. A decoy that would show strength without inviting open battle. Kale watched this soft geometry and thought of the moment he had ordered fire to swallow a village to save another. He saw in Marisol's choices a narrowness of mercy he had never permitted himself. She would not trade blood for blood to make a point. The decoy resulted in a near catastrophe. Titus's scouts, 3 men with eyes like polished knives, caught one of the decoy's trails and followed it, but they were not quick enough to realize they had been baited into a trap that was simply empty. They took a moment to gloat, and that moment let Marisol's recon slip into their vision. They saw her, she saw them. The lead scout recognized Kale's shape before he recognized Marisol's, a name like a slap. "You," the scout hissed, blade rising. For a heartbeat, Kale thought of running. For a heartbeat, he thought of what his presence meant, the smell of ash in the mouths of those who'd been condemned by him. But the choice had been made. Marisol had positioned herself between the camp and the scout, and when she moved, she did so with a clarity that froze the world. "Back," she said, not to Kale, but to the boy at her elbow whose hands had not yet learned to be small. It was a command that carried the crack of law. "Return to the tents." The scout's hand slipped along his dagger. "Your Luna walks with traitors," he said. "She welcomes the devil of a king." Kale's hands were empty. His weapons had been taken when he was exiled. He had learned to fight with the geography of his body and with voices. He stepped forward, not to strike, but to be the thing that drew their intent. "You think I murdered you with law," he said to the scout, voice even but carrying a weight that had once bent packs. "I am hollowed, not cruel. Titus strikes for control. I give you no reason but to take small comfort in him. Take it, but lay no hand on what you cannot claim. The scout laughed, a wet sound. He lunged, not for Kale, but at Marisol, a pawn attempting to take the queen. He wanted to bruise the Luna where she stood proud. In the chaos, a blade nicked Marisol's arm. The cut was shallow, anger a brighter color. Kale moved like a man whose wrongs had been the teaching that now saved him. He grabbed the scout's wrist, twisted, and the man fell. Not dead, but beaten enough to be shamed. Lysa and Kadron swept in and bound the others before they could think, and the scouts were left gagged under a heap of canvas.
The camp exhaled an animal noise that was all relief and dread. But Titus had been sent not to win a battle, but to set a tone. That tone had been set. It rang like a bell. The camp would now be watched more closely. Titus would come to test again. Bigger, smarter. Kale had been recognized. His face, his shape, were now a beacon. The man he'd once been had become a target on other people's maps. Later that night, while bandages were changed and the boy who'd been closest to the scout trembled in a corner, Marisol found Kale by the river, where the moon slivered like a white coin. Her arm bore the shallow line of blood that had been marked by the blade. She braced her jaw against the night. "I wanted to protect you from the price of my blood," she said. "But you stepped in. Why?" There was no accusation, only the raw curiosity of someone who had tried to hold herself apart from him and failed. Kale's answer was a mouthful of ash and longing and the smell of her in the night. "Because I can still do one thing right," he said. "Because men pay for the sins of kings, and I can't bear another child's throat on my hands. Because I thought, foolishly, that if I could keep you small, I'd keep you safe. I was wrong." Her laugh was a thin thread. "You thought keeping me small would keep me safe? I have never been small." He looked at her then, really looked, and all his old arrogance fell away like dead skin. He saw the Luna as she was, not an emblem, but a woman who had learned to pace her rage into cunning. Not a prize, but a force. He wanted to tell her everything, the human with flour-dusted hands, the lie that toppled his throne, but he could not yet. There were still moves to make, and truth unmoored in a time of siege could be a weapon used by the enemy. He had to be sure his confession would not be used as tinder. "We need more than stealth," Marisol said suddenly, voice thinner for the thought. "We need a story that makes the other packs look at Titus and say, 'We cannot be silent.' We need to make him afraid of starting something that would swallow him as well." Kale's mind raced through old councils and battlefields, through the calculus of fear. "A coalition," he said slowly. "Not of lords, but of those with nothing to lose, yet everything to save. We will show him that taking the margins will cost him the center. We will not go to war with teeth and howls. We'll bind the betas who refuse to be bought, and we will find the humans who will testify to the atrocities Titus won't deny. We will starve him of consent." Marisol's eyes lit with something like fever. The strategy was a match struck between two minds trained in different kinds of loss. "And the truth?" she asked. "When will you tell me who you saved? When will you tell me why they burned places to keep others whole?" Kale felt the moon like a weight. "Soon," he promised, the words small, but carrying the weight of a vow. "When the tide is less likely to use it to drown us." She reached up and touched his cheek, fingers cold from the river. "If you have any hope of asking for partnership," she said, "let it be offered from whole hands, not from half-truths. Leadership built on shame bends eventually into the old ways." Her words sank into him like a spear softened by cloth. He had been a man of laws, of jagged rulings that cut away the tender parts, and those rulings had become the blade that exiled him. In the reflection of the river, he saw the man he was trying to be, a leader who could ask for forgiveness and not demand absolution, a man who could teach mercy and not merely wield it as a weapon. They walked back to the camp under a sky that felt like a witness. The scouts' capture would be a currency in their favor for a little while. A narrow window of potential unity opened. But beyond that window lay the storm Titus would bring if his bruised pride could not be soothed. Kale knew that every choice from here on would be measured against what he had done and what he had kept secret. Marisol, with the lantern of her will, had asked him to step into light. He had promised truth soon. The promise hung between them,
a fragile bridge over water that remembered his old flames. As they re-entered the circle of tents, children huddled closer, and the camp's breath synchronized into a rhythm of cautious hope. Kale followed Marisol and felt, for the first time since Exile had taken his name, that his steps might be taken towards something other than punishment. Yet the knowledge of Titus coming struck him like a new kind of cold. He would have to decide, soon and irrevocably, whether to seize the old crown by force, becoming again the sovereign whose hands had scorched, or to redefine power with mercy and honesty, risking everything for the chance at a different kind of rule. The pull between those two futures tightened like a band around his ribs, and the moon watched, indifferent, as if testing whether men would choose light or shadow. The night the first fracture opened, it sounded like glass breaking in slow motion. A messenger stumbled into camp before dawn, breath shredded, cloak sprayed with the kind of mud that belongs to places miles beyond any map. He fell face first into the dust of the central fire ring and could not find his feet for a long while. When he finally looked up, his eyes were hollows that had swallowed fear and not yet returned it. "Titus," he managed, each syllable a small injury. "He brings a banner of the citadel. He says he has proof. He has witnesses. He will speak at noon on the old road." For a second, the camp held as if someone had asked it to stop breathing. Noon on the old road, the place where trades were made, where judges once displayed sentences, where elders went to dispute and sometimes die. If Titus chose that place for a speech, it meant he sought spectacle. If he brought witnesses, he meant to frame the narrative for the entire region.
It was not raw blood that frightened them, but the slow, precise machinery of law twisted into vendetta. Marisol's hands went cold on the rim of the kettle she was stirring. People around her moved like marionettes with frayed strings, arranging bowls, burying knives beneath blankets, whispering petitions to old gods. Kael stepped back into the circle of their lives as others stepped away from him. Faces that had looked at him with wary curiosity tightened. A line of cold recognition traced down spines. "Who are the witnesses?" Kael asked, each word sifted for consequence. The messenger's voice was a thread. "They say there are survivors from villages burned long ago," he said. "Men with burnt hair and eyes like coal, and a woman, one of Titus's own, who says she saw a man who begged for mercy for a human. They call that man a king." Someone in the ring laughed, a sound like brittle twigs. Kadron's hand went to the shaft of his spear and did not leave. "They'll parade our ghosts and call it justice," Marisol said, her voice a knife wrapped in velvet. "They'll make us look like sinners who sheltered sinners." "It will be a show," Lysa said. Her gaze snagged on Kael like a barbed hook. "And shows are for crowds who judge on sight." They decided in the cramped dawn that had become the forerunner of doom to answer, not with open force, but with presence. A small delegation would go to the old road. Marisol as Luna because she could not be upstaged in her own right. Kael because Titus had set blood on him years ago and because his appearance might neutralize the script Titus hoped to sell. They would bring witnesses of their own, the baker who had been fed by Marisol's pack in winter, the healer whose hands had saved a child no one else would touch, the boy Tomas who could call a dog with the right cough. It was a strategy of living testimony. It was also a risk of showing their faces in a place where the old laws could be weaponized. Kael dressed as if to court, slow with consideration. He put on no crowns, there were none, but he smoothed the coarseness of exile from his shoulders, like one straightening a garment for a funeral. Marisol watched him from the tent flap, braid pinned back tight, eyes a map of pain and resolute. "Tell me the truth now," she said, because the hour had thinned and secrets were flammable. "Tell me why you saved them. Tell me, who was the human?" He felt the weight of her request as a physical thing, heavy and urgent and honest. He opened his mouth and a shuddered image spilled out, the scent of flour, a laugh like a bell in a kitchen, hands scarred by mixing dough and learning to turn heat into comfort. Elias. The name came out on a breath that tasted of ash and sugar. He spoke of the man who had taught him to knead bread with both palms, of how Elias had laughed at old superstitions the court clung to like moth-eaten coats, and how he had loved a king who came to his doorway soaked from the rain and confessed fear like a prayer.
Marisol listened as Kael peeled his memory. He did not tell her every intimate scene. There were pockets of tenderness held like contraband even now. But he told her enough. The secret house, the lie given at council to save Elias' life, the night he chose to burn one border village to keep another safe, because that choice would make the human live. He told her how the court had turned the thing meant to save into treason when Titus sculpted the narrative. His voice grew smaller as the telling took him back into the rooms where he had once been both tender and monstrous. When he finished, the camp was very still. The kettle boiled over somewhere, a ritual hiss that felt obscene in its normalcy. "You lied to save love," Marisol said finally. There was no flood of praise in her voice. There was only a map of deformation. "You set a calculus that asked a village to die." "I thought I could buy fewer deaths that way," Cale said. "Each word an admission and a confession and a self-inflicted wound. I thought if I chose where the pain landed, I could make it, a smaller storm. I was wrong." The silence broke, not like a single fracture but a netted web of snapped threads. Some shook their heads with pity, some tightened into fists. Cadron's mouth moved. When he spoke, it sounded like a judgment made of stone. "You used our lives as currency," he said. "You used children as chips at a table you thought you controlled." "Where were you when you burned the village?" Lysa demanded. "Where was your mercy then?" A woman who'd lost a son to a raid spat out a single word: traitor. It came like an arrow. The word splintered the circle, and Cale felt the old shame, the one that had hollowed him and made him leave his crown, rise like bile. He was not surprised by the accusation. He had spent years expecting to be damned for the very thing he had done to save someone he loved. But he had not expected it to be the faces of people he had come to protect who would fling the stones. Marisol shut her eyes briefly, the lashes of a woman who bore weight. She had asked for truth. She had desired salvation born of honesty, but now she felt its consequences like cold rain. Her hand found Cale's and squeezed, not to comfort, but to anchor. Many eyes watched that simple touch, as if they were weighing whether it was a clasp of hope or a chain. "Do you understand why we fear you?" Lysa said. "Do you think being the architect of choices makes you immune to their fallout? There is no law high enough to clean the ash off a child's face." Cale wanted to kneel and scrub their judgments away, wanted to tell them that love had been a compass he had tried to follow and failed, wanted to beg their forgiveness until his voice died, but he had been exiled for begging and for trying to appease courts that found softness a weakness. Begging had become a sacrament that could not redeem him in the eyes of all. Marisol's jaw set. She rose and turned, first to Cadron, then to the ring.
"We don't burn villages," she declared, the Luna in her voice knifing rule into their argument. "We do not decide some lives are more valuable than others. We make choices to protect all we can. Cale's sin is not his alone. It is the old court's sin that made him choose. We are not just a chorus of accusation tonight. We are people who must survive." Her words calmed some, they angered others. The fissure widened. Some packs, even small ones nested in their little border kingdoms, began to imagine who would fill the king-shaped vacuum if Cale's brand of power returned. Fear curdled into action. A group of young men, led by a face Cale had seen snarl since his arrival, muttered about sending scouts into neighboring territories to secure alliances that might keep Titus at bay and keep their own control intact. On the road to the old road, the atmosphere changed into something tense and animal. Titus's parade of witnesses had the efficiency of a machine designed to dismantle people. He had selected his spokesman with the keen eye of a butcher, survivors who could be molded into a chorus of accusation, a woman who claimed to have watched Cale bargain fire for another life, men who could point with precision at dates and names. But Titus also had a trump card that no one had expected, a captured scout from Marisol's decoy, gapping under his questioning like an animal startled into speech. Word came to the edge of the crowd that the scout had cried out a name from the shadows, the Luna. She is the half-blood. The phrase dropped like a stone. The word half-blood carried in it a weapon every bit as sharp as fire. Lycan society treated mixed bloods as anomalies, mistakes of lineage that could be exploited. Titus knew that. He had shined it into a blade. Marisol's face, already lined with fatigue, went slack for the first time. She had never been asked to hide her bloodline. It was a truth she'd kept close like a protected wound. Her mother had been human, a woman who loved a pack and paid for it in ways small and large. The fact had been spoken of in hushes in childhood, but never used before as a weapon.
Now the words spread through the crowd like an oil slick. Half-blood, someone repeated with distaste, as if the syllables themselves could dirty clothing. A man in the back muttered something about contamination. A woman whose father had died in the old wars spat the word with contempt. Cale felt the air go thinner around Marisol. He saw eyes that had only moments before looked to her for guidance flip like cards. He heard whispers. Can she lead? Can she keep pure pack law? He felt anger, a harsh, righteous anger, rise like smoke. Part of him wanted to rip Titus's throat out for using something so intimate as a weapon. A larger part knew that exposing Marisol's lineage here, now, had been deliberate cruelty. Titus knew how to carve distrust and plant it like a seed that would grow into violent proof. Marisol's response was not of denial but of owning.
She stepped onto the low platform where judgments had once been shouted, and the crowd fell silent with the hunger of those craving spectacle. She did not cry. She did not beg. Instead, she stood straight, shoulders square as if made to hold up the sky, and spoke. "My mother was human," she said, voice clear as bell metal. "She taught me to value the warm hands of a baker as much as the hardened claws of a pack. She taught me that mercy was not weakness, but a strategy of survival. If that makes me half-blood to your ears, then I will accept the word with the whole of my heart. But know this, my blood is not a defect. It is the reason my pack eats when others do not. We have been alive because my mother taught me how to bargain with humans and wolves alike. If you think that is weakness, then you are the weaker for it." Her words landed like iron and electrocuted some of the crowd into temporary stillness. Not everyone was mollified. Centuries of prejudice cannot be undone with a single speech. Murmurs shifted toward the brutal and the calculating. Titus smiled like a man who had lit the tinder and watched it catch. In the crowd, someone, either frightened by the turn of events or seduced by a promise of favors, moved. Cadron watched as a group of men he had known since boyhood drifted away from the center. He noticed with a spasm of dismay that 2 of those men crossed into Titus's sphere and were spoken to in brief, urgent murmurs. The trade would be blood for safety. The choice to stay and fight would become, for some, an unfathomable risk to families and stores. When Marisol returned to camp that evening, the fracture that had begun in words had opened into something raw and wet. A faction had formed, people frightened by the word half-blood who whispered of allying with Titus for the preservation of hearths. They did not yet move openly, but the undertow of their betrayal was present. Cale watched them with the horrified clarity of a man watching a wildfire take root just when he thought he could teach people to dampen the tinder. "You will lose people to fear," he said to Marisol, hands pressed to his face like someone who needed to hold his skull together. "I already have," she answered. "I was born with a foot across the line you asked me not to cross. My truth did not change the math tonight. It only gave people permission to think it was their problem to solve with their knives." His confession, the one she had demanded, hung between them like a promise he'd made and now had to account for. He had hoped that telling would create a new geometry of trust. Instead, it had sharpened knives on both of them. Titus had used their truths as tinder. The camp that had looked to be sewn together by survival was now fraying at the edges with suspicion. Old loyalties to comfort, to fear of losing small things, began to whisper the names of those who would sell the pack for scraps. "You did not only save a man," Lysa said to Cale one night, leaning over the map they've been drafting. "You saved a memory we cannot afford." "Forgive me." Cale laughed then, because the man he had been could no longer imagine forgiveness bought with words. There is nothing to buy with regret. And in the quiet that followed, under a moon that made small promises it could not keep, Cale understood the depth of the fracture he'd opened by telling the truth. He had thought confession would be like laundering blood. Enough sun and honesty and it would wash clean. Instead, confession was a blade that could be turned by anyone with the cruel hand. Marisol's secret, his own, had been used by an enemy who understood how to press the soft places of people until they bled out distrust. They stood at the brink together and not together, bound by a new knowledge that the delicate architecture of their alliance would not survive another storm unless they rebuilt differently, leaner, truer, but also more fragile. The bond between them had been stretched thin and tested in public, and if it snapped, they would both fall into a canyon from which neither would climb unscarred. Titus's shadow swelled with the coming week. The camp split into those who would stand and those who would barter. Cale felt the old hunger for power, an old structure that could solve problems with force, rise like a fever.
He hated that hunger and feared that hunger, and knew now that to follow it would be to return to the architecture of his exile. Marisol, with the rawness of betrayal in her eyes, did not beg him to choose a side. She only fixed him with a look that said, "If you become the man who's scorched for the sake of order again, do not expect me to follow. If you become the man who shields me and the children with honesty and sacrifice, then stand and be counted." He had no answer then but to promise, a small, dangerous word. The camp listened, some believed. Others left under the cover of night, their departures a slow bleeding that showed Titus's skill at eroding the margins. Cale and Marisol watched them go, two people leaning toward the same storm and not yet sure whether they would shelter one another from it or be the sparks that lit the next inferno. The first light of dawn found them not arguing but sharpening purpose like blades. Marisol moved with a steady, deliberate calm born of someone who had watched fear thin the edges of her people and decided it would not win. Cale watched her and felt something inside unclench. Not absolution, not yet, but the fragile sinew of hope. They planned not to meet Titus with teeth and thunder, but to undo the confidence of his spectacle by taking away its audience, by making his witnesses question what they'd been paid to say, and by making his men meet the human faces they'd been taught to despise. They split the camp into two rings.
One would play the predictable role, a visible force on the old road, a challenge that would force Titus to show his hand. The other, led by Cale, would move unseen along the old mill road and intercept the couriers bringing witnesses and coin, not to murder, but to uncover. Cale's exile had taught him the geography of absence. Tonight, absence would be their weapon. Marisol's hand found his before they left, fingers lacing with a plea that carried equal parts command and confession. "Return," she said, voice low. "Bring them back without a display. Let the truth be a thing people think on, not a spectacle they are led by." He wanted, in that moment, to promise not just to return but to stay, for her, for the pack, for the children trembling at the edge of the camp. He could feel the hunger to seize power flare and die like a bad fever. Somewhere between wanting and doing, he found steadiness. "I will come back," he said. "If I must die to keep you whole, I'll die standing between your hearth and the world." It was the kind of vow that tasted like salt and danger. She did not ask him to die, she only let him offer the possibility, the true currency of those who live under moons and might. The night moved like velvet and trap. Cale led a small band through culverts and rusted railbeds, fingers on the backs of men who had never learned to trust a fallen king. They moved like ghosts, and when they found the courier's camp, 2 tents, a lantern, 3 sleeping men, they did not kill. Cale woke them with a soft voice and the bluntness of an apology. "You are being used." He offered them a choice instead of a blade. "Show us the ledger. Show us the names." If Titus had paid their mounts, the names would reveal it. One frightened man broke first, and then another. The ledger smelled of tobacco and coin, and of a script that made Titus's intent obvious. Payments, places, timed accusations. Cale bound the men and sent them, with their ledger and their shame, back to the old road where Marisol and the others waited. What happened there was not the theatrics Titus expected. Confronted with proof their testimony had been bought, some witnesses shrank and fumbled for excuses. Others, older, harder, stiffened and swore they had been coerced. The crowd tilting toward spectacle now wavered, and in that tremor, a new thing was born: doubt. Doubt, once planted, is a slow beast that gnaws at certainties until they topple. Titus reacted like a man who had found his stage collapsing. He ordered arrests, then retreated into bluster. When he strode toward Marisol to brand her as traitor and half-blood, Cale stepped between them, as if the old law were a sword and his body its sheath. Titus spat insults, promised retribution, and then made the mistake old men make when they assume fear can be bought forever. He called for blood. Cale did not answer with the ferocity of the old king. Instead, he offered a sacrifice as raw and final as any crown reclaimed. He offered himself.
"Take me," he said to Titus, voice steady and large in the stunned quiet. "Take me in public. Call me what you will,
but do not raise your hand against her pack." The crowd held its breath. Marisol's face went white, and then incandescent with a fierce, private grief. She reached for him, fingers clenched, and for a brief, suspended second, the world narrowed to the axis of their clasp. Cale's choice was both strategy and confession. By offering himself, he stripped Titus of the chance to fashion Marisol's pain into spectacle. He made his own shaming a thing Titus could not fully control without revealing his own cowardice. Titus lunged at the offer like a hound to meet. He seized Cale and dragged him to the old bench where judgments used to be read. He pronounced words meant to crush: exile extended, public humiliation, marking. The crowd howled, some in triumph, others in distaste. But as the sentence unfurled, the ledger was placed before them, and one by one names of Titus's bought mouths were read aloud, by those same mouths now too ashamed to lie. The sound of confession undercut the spectacle. Men who had come to gloat left with their heads bulging with the cost of complicity. Cale took his punishment with the steadiness of someone who had chosen it. They shaved a mark into his cheek, a petty cruelty for symbolic victory, and it stung like a verdict. But when the first blow landed, and then another, Marisol did not retreat. She stepped forward and caught his arm, pulling him into a half-embrace that was not submission but solidarity. Her lips brushed his ear. "You will not bleed alone," she whispered. The crowd gasped, some cheered, some cursed. Titus' plan to isolate and shame had been turned on its head. By offering himself, Cale had forced public reckoning. Men who had followed Titus for crumbs found themselves exposed. Those who had been on the fence swung toward protecting Marisol's pack, not out of love for Cale, but because the spectacle had revealed cruelty on behalf of a man who would sell others for power. The sacrifice did not end with rhetoric. As they dragged Cale away to be held under an old magistrate's custody, a humiliating prison made of public stones, Marisol refused to leave his side. She stood in the square and named the ledger's revelations, calling each corrupt pact into the open. Her courage was a lens that turned the crowd toward truth. That night in the hollowed cell where the moon cut through the bars, Cale felt the weight of what he'd done. He had given himself to save Marisol's people from Titus's reach, and in doing so, had risked the one fragile thing he had found in exile, the possibility of being more than the sum of his sins. He heard footsteps outside, Marisol's, steady as duty. Her hand reached through the slat and found his, fingers warm and insistent. "Promise me," she whispered into the dark, "when this is over, when the smoke clears, that you will let me stand beside you, not as penance, but as partnership."
Cale closed his eyes and let the word partnership settle like a promise into bone. He had not reclaimed a crown. He had surrendered himself to a different kind of rule, one built of sacrifice and return. In that small cell, under the indifferent moon, he answered with what he had left to give: truth, and the shape of a new claim, not taken by force, but earned by the willingness to be broken for those he loved. Dawn found the camp quieter than it had any right to be, not because peace had settled, but because the air had become careful, like people who had learned to wrap fragile things in linen. Cale woke to the scrape of sand against stone, and the memory of the magistrate's bench like a bruise across his ribs. His cheek welted where Titus's men had marked him. It burned with the proof of a sacrifice. Hours before, he had offered himself and been used as both accusation and mirror. Now he was a mirror that others could not look away from. Marisol did not leave his side that morning. She kept pace outside the cell until the ledger's names had been interrogated and confessions wrung out like wet cloths. By noon, the old road bore the residue of reckoning. Men who had been hollowed by coin and promise tried to build excuses out of gravel. Those excuses crumbled when the baker with flour-scarred hands, Elias's apprentice, who had been hidden in the crowd, stood up and told the truth of the bread Cale had loved and the nights of shelter given to humans by Marisol's pack. Truth, when it was human and granular and sticky with small hypocrisy, was harder to dismiss than rhetoric. The Citadel sent envoys to inspect the ledger, and their expressions told another story. Titus could not control every narrative forever. Several of the lesser lords who had nodded to his cruelty in private now kept their faces turned and their mouths small.
The cohort of men who had once called themselves Titus's allies shrank when smoke and ledger and testimony braided into proof that he had bought obedience. A few left with their tails tucked because survival favored those who could smell a losing cause. In camp, wounds were tended and grudges catalogued. The faction that had threatened to barter with Titus dissolved into